last Thursday evening, I was talking to my mother, and I said to her that as an FSU graduate, I'm starting to convince myself that we could be able to win on Saturday against Alabama. And just talking about how that was such a silly thing to do because you don't want to get your hopes up to let you down. But boy, oh boy, could I not be any happier with that result. And it's been quite a little few days here just being able to enjoy that victory because I don't think any other team had as satisfying a win as FSU did over Alabama. Now I'm going to talk about a bunch of games here because I watched a ton of football since it's the beginning of the season still. Super interested in how so many different teams look, but we have to start with Florida State beating Alabama. And not only can I say beating, but really, I don't think I have to talk about this game from one team's perspective losing it or one team's perspective winning it. I think there really was things on both sides of the equation that had the game play out the way it did. From the first play of the game, I doubt most of you had any reason to watch Florida State play last season, but I can tell you that there probably weren't 5 hits that had as much intensity in the 2024 college football season for Florida State than the first snap against Alabama had. Now, the first snap against Alabama was a good run for Alabama, and it wasn't a significantly hard hit compared to other hits you saw later throughout the game that Florida State's defense really brought. But just the intensity you saw on the first play was so reassuring. And then the other thing that ended up being a theme of the weekend, but is a theme of opening games in general, is what coaches are able to do to scheme up and exploit specific things that other teams had as deficiencies the previous season. That's basically to say that there were tons of games over this last weekend where teams went down the field on their first drive, scored a touchdown, and that meant absolutely nothing because it was scripted because of specific looks they knew they were going to be able to take advantage of. The example I always remember is how the game turned out in 2023 for Florida State against LSU. And LSU obviously had so much talent on that roster, and that was a huge win for Florida State. But the first drive of the game, they hit a wheel route out of the backfield, and it's like, okay, yeah, they've had that all offseason ready to pick up 50 yards on that play. And that's just something you always have to remember about early season football, is that when you see it, that first drive can trick a lot of people. And actually, my first thought when Alabama actually got into the end zone finally on that first drive against Florida State was, holy cow, that was scripted to the max. It took that long, and they were so close to having issues that would have caused them to stall out on the drive if they had just if they had gotten one less yard on a few different plays throughout that series. So after that, Florida State on the offensive side of the ball and the defensive side of the ball really set the physical tone completely against what you expect from an Alabama team. And I think one of the other things that was really interesting is looking at who the stars were supposed to be this weekend. Just looking at who the cover athletes are on College Football 26. I'll come back to Jeremiah Smith. But Ryan Williams absolutely was the only player that I really can say for sure I was paying enough attention to say that just the intensity wasn't there for what this game should have been for them. They should have felt so intense. I mean, I don't understand how you can lack intensity for the first game of the season, regardless of the opponent. But Florida State's still a historically prestigious program, even if they had a bad season last season. And our quarterback, on top of that, gave Alabama all the fuel they needed to actually come out and play really well against us. And they didn't. FSU absolutely set the tone. And that was just what we were so proud of. And as for the 2 new coordinators for FSU, hats off, because I don't think they could have done much better. In the third quarter, I would say the offense, with how heavy we went on the run game, felt a little bit too conservative. But then we come back later in the fourth quarter. We go for it from our own 35-yard line on 4th and 1 when Bama's closed it to within a touchdown. And that's like, okay, well, even if you're going to go heavy in the run game and not pass the ball as much, I'll take that for some balance to be aggressive enough to see 4th and 1 and say, hey, we've been choosing to run it all game. We're going to run it again and pick up tough yards, and we're going to run it extremely strongly and push Alabama's defensive line backwards and hit them like we did all game. That was incredible. From the Bama side of things, I think this is going to be a wake-up call for them. I mean, to an extent, there's always going to be a thing where if you have a certain level of talent, it's going to be pretty difficult to lose to a number of opponents. So thinking about who else they play out of conference, I mean, those are almost guaranteed wins for Alabama. But with how that goes into SEC play for them, it really could start to look dicey if other teams have more intensity than them. I don't expect that, though. I expect they're going to look at this and realize that they didn't bring the intensity they needed to bring to that game, and it'll probably teach them a lot of learning lessons. I wouldn't sell out on Alabama yet. I think for all the college football I watched over the weekend, and I watched probably 6 games start to finish along with the highlights for many others, maybe even 7 games start to finish. I would say that Florida State looked the most prepared to play in the first game of any team I watched this weekend. So really don't take that as a huge indictment on Alabama yet, even though I know it's hard to overreact either way. And that's also not to say that Florida State couldn't also come back out even next week against an FCS opponent and drop off in intensity a lot. You just got to make sure that, like Nick Saban always said, you avoid the rat poison. So with that, I think that's good for the points on my game. Now I can start going through the other games. The next game I want to talk about is Georgia Tech, Colorado. Georgia Tech, I feel this offseason has really been underrated. I think what they're bringing back, their offensive scheme especially, is a very special scheme, and they have special players for that special scheme, meaning they have players that fit their scheme really well. And Haynes King is one of my favorite players in the country to watch. He is absolutely tremendous at giving all the effort he possibly could throughout a whole game and never, ever being upset with taking a beating throughout a game. And when you have a quarterback similar to Tommy Castellanos for FSU that's willing to put their body on the line for the whole game and actually be happy about it, that really not only opens up your offense, but probably also gives a huge morale boost to your team. And I think that's tremendous. And I saw that at the end of last season for Georgia Tech. I'm sure plenty of people watched Georgia Tech play Georgia last year. And the only thing I have to say about that game is how frustrated I was that Georgia Tech wasn't even willing to try to run the ball seemingly much at all on those 2-point conversions at the end of the game to try to beat Georgia. They were looking to throw, and it felt like they were running the ball down Georgia's throat late in the season. So if they can recognize that the run game is really where they'll see success, I think that they're in for another good season. And I think what I saw Friday night convinced me that that is what's going to be the case. And there's tons of teams I'm going to talk about today where I don't necessarily feel like I have confidence in them, good or bad, one way or another. We're going to have to see how things develop. But I feel really good about Georgia Tech, especially starting off with the 3 turnovers in the game, setting yourself back that much, but also on the other end, bowing up on defense enough to only make that 3 turnover margin that you gave them right off the bat turn into 7 points. That's a great perspective for the defense. And on the other side of that, being able to overcome that on the offensive side of the ball, especially because it wasn't something they dealt with adversity-wise last season, and they really were able to settle in. And honestly, I don't know how you should look at turnovers. I don't think they're terribly predictable without just tremendous, tremendous players that make insane plays. And I wouldn't necessarily say that Colorado's defense or Georgia Tech's defense has any of those players that just consistently make those plays like a Travis Hunter would have the past few years for Colorado. But I would expect that that's going to get cleaned up. Like I said, I can't say it's terribly predictable, but I wouldn't expect Georgia Tech to continue turning the ball over. So if they can win a game on the road when they play a good team and they do turn the ball over, I feel even better about how I did with them before the season, even though they had a game where they started right off the bat with 3 turnovers. But let's get to the Colorado perspective on this. I think Colorado should be really proud of what they did. This was one of the few games where I felt good about both teams coming out of it. I know I started with FSU Bama, and I've kind of illustrated that I felt relatively decent about both those teams at least. But I feel good about where these teams are because I really thought before I saw this Colorado team in action, I thought I could come to the conclusion after the first game that they may only win 5 games. And I feel a lot better about them now, at least competing in the Big 12. And that's not going to be the case for every team that I talk about today. I think there was a little bit of a little too much negativity towards Caden Salters, but I think that also probably can cool down now because we've actually seen the rest of the weekend and we saw how much more other quarterbacks even struggled in games this weekend. So with that being the case, I feel good about both those teams. That's not a conference game for either team. So I feel like they both can actually compete in their conference races. I would still say neither of them are favorites, but I like where both of them sit right now. Next, we got to talk about the Thursday game between USF and Boise State because I could not believe it. I could not believe what I was seeing because the first drive thing that I talked about earlier where teams trick you into thinking something after one drive of a game in the first game of the season, that extended out to the entire first quarter of the USF Boise State game. Basically, I'm sitting there watching the game for the whole first quarter thinking to myself, God, USF just keeps making these silly mistakes. It felt like they'd made 4 or 5 of them already up to the end of the first quarter against Boise State, up until the very last play of the quarter where they hit a long shot play down the seam. And it was like, if they do that all day, they're not going to be able to compete with Boise State. And I could not have been more wrong. I could not believe how they were able to put pressure on Boise State in terms of keeping their scoring. The fake punt was absolutely huge in making Boise State feel the pressure to get back into that game. And I think if they don't hit that fake punt, and even if they're able to get a field goal on that drive instead, which they weren't in field goal range, that game could turn out much differently because now we've got Boise State down 2 scores after they hit that fake punt that goes for a touchdown. And Boise State was putting on the pressure, and they started going for it on 4th down really early. And once that pressure was on, it was able to get away from them. And that's how USF really ran away with it. And that's not to take anything away from them. They had to complete that fake punt pass just to get the first down, and then to score the touchdown on top of that was even more incredible. And then they just kept the pressure on. I mean, absolutely wonderful coaching job there by the USF staff. And on the other hand, Boise State, though, I think you can still feel okay about the team because it was all there. It was all there, and it really comes down to just some bad luck on 4th downs once you started going for it. Maybe the one thing I would critique on that is that they started going for it a little too early because they're down 10 and they started going for 4th downs at that point and then saw a bunch of them consecutively that they couldn't convert. But I wouldn't be too worried. On the other hand, I wouldn't be too worried about Boise State moving forward with conference games and such. I think this is a big deal in terms of the G5 race, though, because I would say that both these teams still are probably expected to be favorites in their conferences, And that G5 bid for the playoff, at least that one guaranteed G5 bid for the playoff, because that's what I'd expect, only one bid from the G5, but it could be more. That's going to be big for this. So I would still expect Boise State to compete in their conference, but that's a big margin of defeat to have if we're looking at it at the end of the season for a potential college football playoff bid if Boise State does win the Mountain West. On the other side for USF's schedule is extremely interesting from here. If they can beat a team like Boise State by 27, and we have other teams that we haven't seen a ton from yet, which is the University of Florida, who just played Long Island, which I think I've heard a number of people say that they didn't know Long Island had a football team or a university at all. So I think that's a fair point. So USF is going to play Florida this week. And the interesting thing is they could be the team that's representing the G5, but I think to do that, even with this win over Boise, they can't get blown out. And not only do they play Florida this week, but their next game is against Miami. So really what I'm asking for from USF here is, even if they're able to have a great rest of their season, win their conference, if it's 2 losses against Miami and Florida, I think you have to keep both those games probably under – both of those games have to be under 20-point margins of victory for those other teams, and you probably need one of them to only be 2 scores. And if you can get it down to 1 score, even better. But if you get throttled 35, 42 points against one of them, I think that really hurts your playoff bid chances. And that could be really interesting because I still think the American could be the best conference in the G5 this year. But if they don't compete against their big boys who they've got on their schedule, it could be a bad look for them. And like I said, it's just compete. It can't be like a 5 or 6 score game. That's really what it can't be if they want to look at something really big for a G5 program. But they should absolutely feel great about competing in the American this year. The Thursday-Friday games, just in general, there were way too many games that had way too close of margins for what teams were favored by. And I could go through a list, but that was just a really interesting thing that played out Thursday-Friday. There were a lot of really tight games that shouldn't have been really tight games. And one of them was Nebraska-Cincinnati. Nebraska looked like the better team, but I think sadly with this Matt Rule year 3 thing, I was disappointed with how they looked. I thought they would come out looking a lot better considering who they faced on the opposite side of the field. But with Cincinnati and where their coach is at as well, I would say I've expected more out of this program to be further along from where they actually are now. So with where both those teams are, I would say both of them disappointed. Raiola disappointed, and on the other end, Cincinnati really disappointed. But it was interesting because of the fact that they disappointed in just not trusting their quarterback at all until the 2-minute drill. And then finally, when they did trust their quarterback, it seemed like they saw a decent amount of success in the pass game until the deep shot that got intercepted by Nebraska. So really just disappointed with both those teams and kind of feeling a little bit of a negative trajectory on them both going further into the season. But they could pick things up. They both absolutely look like they had the talent to pick things up. It was a sloppy game that really I did not enjoy watching much at all. Sadly, I have to talk about this. I love watching Service Academy football, but seeing that Tarleton State took down Army was rough for someone like me who enjoyed watching Army so much last year because of how fun Bryson Daly was and the entire rest of the team there. That's a really tough look because I knew that they were going to see a drop-off. I was not expecting that much of a drop-off to be able to drop that first game to that opponent. Navy looks like they're going to be pretty good this year too, and I'd say Air Force is going to be the team that's in between them. For where that's sitting right now, I'm just really nervous about how poorly the season could go for Army, But we'll see if they can pick things back up, because I'm going to talk about a game they've got next week fairly soon. The next thing, since I spent the last year basically in Pittsburgh, I thought it was very interesting that the backyard brawl opponents for Pitt and West Virginia actually were both able to find opponents this weekend that were closer to them than the opponent they would play in the backyard brawl, because you would think that the backyard brawl would have two opponents right next to each other, because they are, but they actually both found closer opponents, because Duquesne's closer to Pitt than West Virginia, and Robert Morris is closer to West Virginia than Pitt. So I just thought that was a funny note to tell people who may not know that geography too well. Ohio State, Texas. This is the game I'm supposed to lead with, right? Because this is the big game of the week. And all I can say about that game is that I came away unimpressed with either team. I feel like everybody wants to talk up the defense for both of these teams. They obviously want to say a lot of negative things about Arch Manning too. But I just thought, the way I looked at it, I've watched a number of games in the past and thought that they were games where defenses played really well, and I wanted to compliment defenses. I didn't want to compliment defenses in this game, and this is the only game I actually bothered to make a pick for from last week, and it really, it seemed like it was the truth. It seemed like the exact thing that I said would be the reason that Ohio State would win was. And I just trusted their receiver talent more. And one of those big touchdowns for Ohio State was the difference in the scoreboard. And on the other end, it just felt like for the times that Arch missed open Texas receivers, there were so many others where guys were just blanketed. I really think Texas, for all the talent that they accumulate on their roster, has still had a surprisingly poor receiving core in recent years. And I don't watch a ton of Texas football. It's just every big game I've watched with them playing in it, I've been really underwhelmed by the receivers. And I feel like so many other people have been telling me that I'm supposed to be happy with it. And we'll see how Arch develops. Arch could absolutely develop. And if he hits a number of those passes in those games, even with the underwhelming receiving core that I'm describing, they may be able to tie that game and actually go on to take it to OT and maybe even win or something like that. But also, if they had been willing to settle for field goals at any point, the one touchdown they could have scored could have had a 2-point conversion attempted after it, and that could have had them go for the tie as well to take it to OT. And I just think that I was really disappointed with both teams. More disappointed with Texas, but still, I thought Ohio State's offense would show up more. Ryan Day did say after the game that, at least I think I caught him saying something about limiting the quarterback, really, Julian Sayin, and I just think that was the wrong decision, because I think if they had actually put the ball up in the air a bit more, been a little bit more aggressive, they could have ran away with this game. And that's how they've played it close against Michigan in recent years and lost games that they shouldn't have. But they're also the defending national champion, or they were the national champion last season, and you can interpret whether or not they're defending that title. Moving on, though, Tennessee-Syracuse. I thought this was a really interesting game because I wasn't expecting as many big pass plays from Tennessee as we were able to get, and I was really interested what Syracuse would look like after last season, because of the fact that Syracuse had such a good year and we're excited with their coach, but we're losing a lot, mainly their quarterback. And I can say happily, I was impressed with both teams in this game. I was very much surprised by how prolific still Tennessee's passing game looked, because I knew how much of a running team they ended up being last season. And on the other end, once I saw that ability from Tennessee, I was like, oh boy, Syracuse could get stomped in this game. But I was really proud of that team. They showed a lot more resilience than a number of other teams this weekend. So I wouldn't write them off yet. I don't think that the roster's terribly talented, but I did like how the coaches got the Syracuse players to play. And on the other end, I was more excited by the talent I saw for Tennessee that I thought they may be lacking going into this season, considering things like their quarterback situation and such. Oh boy, the teams that I had to talk about week 0 because they were in the Dublin game. Iowa State absolutely throttled South Dakota. So great for them. They continue on this upward trend that I described after week 0 last week, and I feel like I need to touch on these teams just because I talked about them last week. On the other hand, Kansas State and North Dakota, Kansas State took it to the wire against North Dakota. And I'm not saying that South Dakota and North Dakota are of equal caliber. I think they ended up having almost completely opposite records last year. So the quality of opponent may not be there. But trend-wise, these are both FCS schools, high-level FCS schools in the past. Relatively recently, they've played pretty well in the FCS. And just seeing how Iowa State turned around from the game that they won and how Kansas State turned around from a game they lost, you would think they would come out with such conviction, not in the fact that they won, but the fact that they needed to get better because they already lost a game to Iowa State. And Kansas State just really disappointed in that game against North Dakota, and Iowa State continues to trend upwards, so love that. Missouri State is now an FBS team, in case you missed that. So I just thought it was really important to point out that usually when you see these insane numbers between a team that scores in the 60s in college football or even the 70s, it's usually because they faced an FCS school. USC faced Missouri State this weekend, and they are an FBS school now, and they still went over 70 points. So I just thought that was noteworthy. That's why I wanted to talk about that. LSU Clemson. I couldn't watch this game in full, but from what I took away from it, honestly, great job LSU. I don't think from what I saw from them, I have enough of a background to say I have a ton of takeaways. I am very impressed with that win, though, for them as a program, because I didn't think they would go to Clemson and win that game. I really didn't see that coming at all. I thought with the trend of Brian Kelly losing the opening games of the season, I thought before this game, they haven't won since Joe Burrow was in school for his final year. They haven't won an opening game since then, and I thought this was the most difficult of the games they've had to play as an opening game since then, on the road at Clemson, and they absolutely showed up for the test. And many people are saying that the score should have been wider in favor of LSU, and that kind of goes to how I feel about Clemson. Feel great about LSU. Do not feel good about Clemson right now. I expected Clemson to win the ACC. Not only win the ACC, but honestly, I would say before the season, I was expecting them to I thought the lesser competition in the ACC would allow them to go into the playoff feeling fresher than other teams, and that may give them a real opportunity to potentially win the national championship this year. And I can say it really only took 1 week of what they put out there for me to completely change my tune on that. This is probably a little bit premature, but they could make the playoff, but I would say that's their high end. I really did not see. I was really disappointed with Cade Klubnik specifically, and I thought he didn't show high-end potential that I was thinking we may see in year 3 from him. And I was just really disappointed with him in general, across the board. Offense was really disappointing. Like they said, defense could have led up even more points. 17 looks like a good number on the scoreboard, but like I said, it probably should have been more. I didn't have a lot of positive takeaways from Clemson, maybe at all, and that was really discouraging for what I thought they could be. So probably should take that with a grain of salt, considering how good I thought they could be before the season, but maybe they just really can't notch it up from where they were last season. Maybe they'll level off at where they were last season. South Carolina, Virginia Tech. Very disappointed in Virginia Tech's offense. That's got to be the immediate takeaway from Virginia Tech. Beyond that, I thought South Carolina would outmatch them anyways. So So I wasn't surprised with the result of the game. I just thought it would be a little bit more high scoring. On the South Carolina side, I did expect them to have more points, but I thought the Virginia Tech defense played very well for what I was expecting them to do. And on the other hand, I think Lenore Sellers, after week 1, probably looks like the best player in the country. So we'll have to see if it continues to trend that way. But right now, with how he played in that first game of the season against that opponent, that was absolutely tremendous. And there were about 3 plays in that game that were jaw-dropping, make you think, man, maybe this guy could win the Heisman. Maybe he could, because I didn't see many other guys this weekend in competitive games that really made the jaw-dropping plays that he did. Then, the other game on Sunday, Miami-Notre Dame. I don't actually have a lot to say on this. Great job from Miami. It's kind of just an upset. They were really close in the rankings. It's an upset because of the fact that Notre Dame made it to the national championship last season, and that's probably why they were ranked a little bit higher preseason. But I looked at these teams pretty similarly going into this game, and I can say that the experience of the quarterback is what allowed Miami to get past Notre Dame. Now the question is, if this game was played a few weeks down the road and Notre Dame's quarterback had a little bit of experience under him, if Notre Dame would have been able to come all the way back, I think there's a chance of it. But right now, not only a takeaway from this Miami-Notre Dame game, but just in general, I think experienced quarterback play is going to matter a lot still for a few weeks to come in this college football season. That looks like where it's trending, and I would expect that trend to continue at least until we're halfway through the season. And then maybe some guys that are younger, that are inexperienced, start to come on and show us more stuff. But defense across the country has started out strong. And that's my main takeaway from Miami-Notre Dame. I think both teams looked good, though. I didn't have really a negative opinion on either of them. Just more experience for the Miami QB in Carson Beck. Then, we've got the closer of the week, Labor Day. TCU absolutely destroys UNC. So let's talk about TCU a little bit first. TCU won 9 games last year, and I can tell you, I didn't watch any of them. So I didn't know what this team would look like this year because I don't remember watching a game of theirs last year. But a 9-win season is a great season. And coming in against a roster that has 70 transfer players, that really makes you think that you're going to have an advantage. But obviously, this is also the same TCU team that, coming off a national championship appearance, lost to Colorado and Deion Sanders in his first game. So, looking at that, it was a very interesting element, but obviously they took that lesson away from that game a few years ago and absolutely figured out how to have the perfect perspective to come out and just absolutely destroy North Carolina. The interesting thing is, I can go back to one of the points I've made over and over again, that first drives of games absolutely lie week 1 of the season. And hopefully in seasons down the road, we do not forget that. But it absolutely does. And North Carolina went down the field, even hit 2 pass plays, chunk pass plays, may I add, that set up a touchdown run. And it felt like, oh boy, maybe this is going to work. Because before the game, I was like, yeah, if I was picking, I understand that these guys at the desk, because the college game day guys were still there last night for TCU UNC, and I was like, I can understand that they're their friends. They're friends with Belichick and stuff, so they want to pick his team. But I was like, it's a really bad look for this team in TCU that's way more experienced and got way more consistency on their team, especially with what I said, the quarterback position over and over again. And I hadn't watched their quarterback play before, but I was very impressed with his game. And before today, I wouldn't have said that I expected TCU to be a competitor for the Big 12. I very much think that they can be one of the teams at the top of the league. On the other side of things, for UNC, with all the turnover, you knew they had to get better. But what I was majorly disappointed with is just how much Bill Belichick he could not have preached fundamentals more. And I'm honestly a guy who most of the time, NFL-wise, was really impressed with a lot of things that Belichick's teams did and what they were able to take advantage of. But they were always able to take advantage of the small margins. Like, the plays that were expected to be made by either team were made, but then there was one play a game that Belichick schemed up defensively or on special teams. Sometimes you could feel his impact on offense, but it was usually on defense or special teams, where he would put a guy in a position to make a play that the opposing coaches wouldn't have been able to think of to put their player in that position. And because of that, that was the margin that could win him a game. So coming to the college level, hearing him say over and over again that he's preaching fundamentals, it's like, okay, that's not going to be it, but they're going to play sound football. They're not going to make mistakes. And the number one takeaway, even before I talk about how many times they turn the ball over, which for a team like his is shocking with the fundamentals thing, is how poor the tackling was. I said I watched 7 full games this weekend. Of the 7 full games I watched, I don't think I saw a team tackle worse than UNC did on Monday night. And I just thought that was so discouraging. He talked so much about fundamentals, and the number one fundamental, tackling, looked that bad. And beyond that, like I said, the turnovers were even worse. Just like, I don't know how they came to the conclusion after watching Gio Lopez, how far he got into the game, and then watching Max Johnson. I don't know if it's injury concern and just being like, he just had a major injury. We don't want to pick the guy who could get injured again to be the starter. I feel like that had to be the decision, because once Johnson got in the game, he looked so much better than Gio Lopez did. Gio Lopez just looked so unprepared. Like, as soon as they were down more than 3 points, it was a crisis, because it's like, we're not supposed to be throwing the ball. We're just supposed to be running the ball. And I thought that was an issue with the fundamentals thing too, is it was just like, when I say fundamentals, I just mean we're going to run the crap out of the ball and not even attempt to be creative on the offensive side of the ball. And I thought that was a really bad look too. And when it's Freddie Kitchens and you actually have the NFL and college background to know how Freddie Kitchens' time in the NFL ended, that's not a good look for the offense. The offense was really disappointing. The defense wasn't disappointing in any way except for the tackling. But the tackling is such a fundamental thing, it doesn't feel like that can be glossed over at all. So just disappointing across the board. They're going to have to go back to practice and get ready. And what's even weirder is their next game is on the road at Charlotte. Obviously, probably a lot of North Carolina alumni that live in Charlotte, but having to go on the road to play at Charlotte, that would not be a game that I'm usually interested in watching. But I'm going to be really nervous if they don't win that by 3 scores, because as far as I know, that Charlotte team should have a lot of recent turnover as well. They shouldn't be a competitor in their conference. And if they're not able to even handle them, that's going to be really concerning. But like I said, even though I'm saying all this stuff about UNC, still want to state clearly, very impressed with TCU. I don't think TCU made one real identifiable mistake during the game last night against UNC, and I think that's really impressive for them. UNC just also looked bad on top of TCU looking great. Looking ahead to next week, since I gave one prediction last week and got it right, I guess I'll continue to do one prediction a week, and I'll try to pick a game that's expected to be relatively close. I talked about how K-State's been trending and Iowa State's been trending, and I like one program going way up, one program headed down. So my pick for next week, I'll take the Cyclones over the Hawkeyes in the Iowa State game. Iowa State's the home team too in this game, so that makes me feel good about where they sit, and I liked what I saw from them. And Iowa hasn't had a competitive game yet, while Iowa State does have did have a competitive game week 0 of the season, I think that could be a helpful reason that they're able to pull it out in the end as well, because they've already got some experience with that this season. So Iowa State over Iowa is my pick for next week. Talking about a few other games that I'm going to keep my eye on, though, I just want to mention James Madison goes to Louisville on Friday night. Louisville is not necessarily expected to do anything huge this season in the ACC. They are expected to be a decent competitor, though. But I think more importantly, this is a big game for JMU because of the fact, like I talked about USF already, going to Florida and Miami the following week. JMU could be the team representing the G5 this year. They're expected to be one of the best teams in the G5, and if they are, it's going to tell a lot about where they are in their competition against Louisville on Friday night. That game's going up against Chiefs Chargers, though, too. So you may want to do a double screen for that if you're interested in both the NFL and college football. Next, I did not realize this game was on the schedule until I looked at it for next week. Kansas is playing Mizzou. I would expect Mizzou to win this game, but with what I've been hearing about Kansas, how electric their quarterback is and really can be dynamic in the run game, if he's able to hit some big plays on the ground, this could start to get interesting really quickly. Once again, I fully expect Mizzou to win, but I do think there's a chance, so I want to point it out as a game to keep your eye on. West Virginia has to travel to Ohio this week. Not Ohio State. They have to go to Ohio. So that's a fun, weird, out-of-conference game. So I'll just point it out because it's on the schedule. Already talked about USF at Florida. Then here's the one with the teams I absolutely bashed already. I said Kansas State came off the game against Iowa State, and a popular phrase that you may have heard of from a famous college football YouTuber talks about wounded animal mode for certain teams. I was hoping K-State would look like that against their FCS opponent this past week, and they did not. Well, what if Army is now in wounded animal mode after losing to Tarleton State? So Army's going to Kansas State this week. If Kansas State wins by 24, okay, that's the expected result or something. But Army in wounded animal mode when Kansas State couldn't really show up in wounded animal mode last week, that's making me interested. And I already said I'm very disappointed with K-State so far. That could quickly turn into just what is going on the farm out there. Lastly, the last game I'm very interested in. I told you after week 0 to not write off UNLV yet. Don't take first game for a new coach too seriously, especially if they're still able to pull out a win in a game where they're facing a much lesser opponent. The score to their game last week against Western Kentucky was much better, and one of the perks of having your home venue be in an NFL stadium is you may be able to get some bigger programs to come to you to play against you when they wouldn't otherwise consider it. And UCLA looked bad last week. Tulane did a great job getting a win over Northwestern where they dominated. So they're a G5 team that has a win over a Big Ten school. Potentially, I want to watch UNLV UCLA this week because if UNLV is able to get a win over a Big Ten school, they could also be a tremendous competitor in trying to be the best G5 team this year. So with that being said, that's all I've got for this week. But most importantly, after this week, I have to say to you to close out, if you're a recruit and you ain't going to Florida State, what you doing?
So, if you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching.
2020 president candidate.